Rebuilding Zion. The Book of Daniel. Isaiah prophesied in Judah both before and also during the reign of the God-fearing Hezekiah, when under his influence things seemed outwardly to be better. Yet the prophet had to reveal the hidden corruption under the surface. In our Bibles, his book is followed by that of Jeremiah, who was raised up of God to speak for him in the last sad days of Judah's history, when things were hopelessly bad and beyond recovery, and the blow fell on them through Nebuchadnezzar. The 7 nations of Canaan had formerly inhabited the land and done horrible things in it, so much so that God sent Israel against them under Joshua with orders to exterminate them. But now the Lord has to say through Jeremiah, a wonderful and horrible thing is committed in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means, and my people love to have it so, and what will ye do in the end thereof? Jeremiah 5 verses 30 to 31. What God did through the Babylonian king in the end thereof, Jeremiah had to see and experience to his deep sorrow. We may get some idea of the depth of his grief if we read the book of Lamentations, which follows his main prophecy. This book is followed by Ezekiel, who was carried amongst many others into captivity in the days of Jehoiakim some years before the final crash fell on Zedekiah, which Jeremiah witnessed. In the land of his captivity he saw in vision the glory, which marked the presence of God, departing from temple and city, and if God was gone, all was lost. Yet each of these 3 prophets predicted God's future intervention in a way that would be altogether new. Isaiah foretold things that should be absolutely new. Even new heavens and a new earth, brought about by the twofold advent of the Messiah, first as the humbled servant, to suffer for sins, and then as the mighty arm of Jehovah redeeming in power what he had first redeemed by his blood. Jeremiah follows, predicting that these new things will be established, not on the old covenant of law but on a new covenant of grace. Let Jeremiah 31 verses 31 to 34 be read and note how again and again, I will, appears, rather than the, if you will, of Exodus 19 verse 8. In this new covenant God is going to act according to his own thoughts and purposes in grace, based on the work of Christ, as unfolded by Isaiah. Ezekiel completes the prophetic outline that is given to us by these 3 major prophets. In Ezekiel 36 he foretells the new birth that will take place with a remnant of Israel before they enter on millennial blessedness, and his next chapter speaks of how they will be spiritually quickened and brought into a new order of life. This brings us to Daniel, who raised up by God just as the times of the Gentiles, Luke 21 verse 24, began under Nebuchadnezzar. He was enabled of God to give us a prophetic outline of the course of these times, during which the Messiah would be cut off. Hence tribulation is to be the portion of the people, but with the hope of deliverance at the end. Daniel's prophecy falls quite simply into 2 parts after the introductory chapter, which relates the courageous stand of Daniel and his 3 companions against the taint of idolatry, and the way God honored it. From the point where the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Syriac, Daniel 2 verse 4, to the end of Daniel 7, this language of the Gentiles is used, and Hebrew is only reverted to as we start Daniel 8. Thus the historical details and the prophecies that relate to the Gentile powers are written in the Gentile language. Then in the 5 chapters that complete the book things are revealed to Daniel that mainly concern his people, though details as to the nations are referred to. Daniel 1. 3 times did Nebuchadnezzar and his servants come up against Jerusalem, when the 3 kings, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim and Zedekiah, fell before him. On the first of these occasions, Daniel and his 3 friends were carried captive amongst a number of youths of royal or princely birth, who were considered to be of exceptional intellectual capacity, the pick of the nation in wisdom and understanding. The astute Babylonian king intended to fortify his position with the cleverest men of conquered nations, working them into the army of magicians, the men who traffic with demon powers, and gave him guidance by their occult practices. So Daniel and his friends were to go through a kind of college course that would make them to be cunning in knowledge and understanding science, the science being doubtless connected with those curious arts, mentioned in Acts 19 verse 19, as practiced in Ephesus at a later date. If the great Babylonian monarch could increase the number of men who could give him supernatural wisdom and guidance, his power would be further increased. Hence their food and drink was to be of a special and prescribed course from the king's table, the very best of the land, and doubtless of a kind that was connected with idolatrous rites. And further, by the prince of the eunuchs each had his original name discarded. They had come under new ownership, and this was signalized by new names of idolatrous origin and significance. Such was the position in which Daniel and his companions found themselves. Reaching Daniel 1 verse 8, our thoughts are arrested by the words, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself." A great statement this. Had he not so purposed? No book of Daniel would have found a place in our Bibles. Notice in the first place that the Spirit of God in the record disowns his heathen name, and uses his original one, which means, God is judge. The man evidently lived in the light of his name, and so we notice, in the second place, that he purposed, not in his head, the seat of intelligence, but rather in his heart, the seat of affection Godward, before whom he walked. This is the kind of purpose that stands firm and does not vary. Then, in the third place, notice that it was defilement that he was determined to avoid. From a material standpoint, the food was pure without a doubt. It was the spiritual defilement he had in view, since Babylon was the original hotbed of idolatry. His three friends are not mentioned in verse 8, but if we turn to Daniel 3 verse 18, we discover they were entirely of the same mind and purpose as he was. Let us take very seriously to heart the lesson that confronts us here. The secret of Daniel's remarkable power was his purposed separation from the evil world that surrounded him. He knew its defiling power and he refused it. Some 5 centuries after his day, its true character was fully and finally exposed in the cross of Christ, as he himself said, "Now is the judgment of this world," John 12 verse 31. We now live in the light of this fact, and we know that it is dominated by Satan, who is the god of this world, 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, hence a purposed separation from the world is more necessary for us than it was even for Daniel. There was with him, however, not only great firmness of purpose but also a wise and humble spirit in making it known. God had acted on his behalf, bringing him into favor with the prince of the eunuchs and with Melzar his subordinate, yet he did not presume on this and speak haughtily. He rather stated his desire, and presented his prayer that he and his friends might be fed on the plainest of food for 10 days as a test, and on the result of this the situation should be stabilized. God was with them, and as a result they were delivered from the defilement that otherwise would have been theirs. From this incident, let us learn a lesson. Separation from defilement is ever God's path for his saints, but much depends on the spirit they display as they take it. If taken in a harsh or haughty spirit, rather than a meek and lowly spirit, the testimony to others will be nullified. If our spirit in taking it is marked by, "Stand by thyself, come not near to me, for I am holier than thou," the spirit that marked the Pharisees of our Lord's day, we shall be helping on the evil from which we profess to be separating ourselves. Daniel and his friends sought their separation, and maintained it, in the right spirit. Consequently, God was with them in a truly remarkable way. Not only were they fairer and fatter in their bodies, but in knowledge, skill, learning, wisdom they excelled all the others who had their portion of the king's meat, and as for Daniel, he was granted a supernatural understanding in visions and dreams, by which in those days God often made his mind known. When tested before Nebuchadnezzar, the verdict was clear. The magicians and astrologers were men who traffic with the powers of darkness in order to possess knowledge beyond the powers of ordinary men, and compared with these the 4 men, taught of God, were 10 times better. There is nothing surprising in this. Indeed, the same thing meets us in more emphatic form in 1 Corinthians 2, where we read that the princes of this world knew nothing of God's wisdom, so much so that they crucified the Lord of glory. Whereas the simplest believer, indwelt and controlled by the Spirit of God, judges, or discerns, all things. Before passing from chapter 1, we may remark that this question of food contaminated by idolatrous practices was acute among the early Christians at Corinth. They were instructed as to it in Paul's first epistle to them, 1 Corinthians 8, and 1 Corinthians 10 verses 25 to 31. Meat sold in the markets or supplied in a friend's house they could eat without raising any question, but if they were definitely informed that it had been offered in sacrifice to idols, they were to have none of it. In this the Christian keeps clear of idolatrous associations just as Daniel and his friends did.